So Calvin grows up or is born about 10, 15 years after Luther's really starting to go, right? So he's growing up in the 1530s, 1540s. He is also born in France, right? So there's an age difference here, a region difference as well. His family had largely been lower class, but eventually his father had become a lawyer and had some connections. He too had a strained relationship with his father and grew up in a single-parent household. Calvin's mother had died when he was rather young. But due to his father's connections, he's able to study in Paris. And he begins studying theology. But he too also becomes interested in this humanistic outlook. I'm sorry, we haven't. Evidently, it moves back a slide when it kicks off and kicks back on. So he begins studying theology, but then he becomes interested in humanism. Right? So he too is interested in this classical philosophy, ancient languages. It's also in the University of Paris where he begins to encounter the works of John Wycliffe, John Huss, and Martin Luther. His father ends up having some disagreements with a bishop who had helped Calvin get to the university, and so instead of studying theology, he encourages John to start studying law. Plus, being a lawyer pays better, even back in the 1500s, than being a theologian or a priest. Eventually goes to the University of Orleans there in France to study law. But he's also continuing to study Greek, he's studying Hebrew, the classics, especially after his father dies. Right? So he becomes a lawyer, but he's also interested in the humanist project. He publishes his first book while he's finishing up in Orleans, which is a commentary on the Roman philosopher Seneca, who had lived around the same time as the Emperor Nero and around the same time as the Apostle Paul. Right, so somebody that had been very much in the past. But it's also during this time somewhere where he converts to Protestantism. It's unclear when he did it. It's unclear what led him to do it. It's not really something that there's good historical evidence about. But essentially, he wants to become the Protestant Erasmus. Erasmus was this humanist scholar, but he was still very Catholic. Calvin says, I want to be that kind of scholar, but I want to be Protestant. Calvin, though, is part of a growing number of French Protestants. And the French Protestants eventually gain the attention of not only the king in France, but the Holy Roman Empire, and they start persecuting the French Protestants. And Calvin goes into hiding, and eventually travels to Switzerland. During this time, he writes, beginning in 1536, Institutes of the Christian Religion. It's about the principles of the Christian religion. And it's about 500 pages when it's first released. It will continue to be expanded throughout his life. It's made up of about 6 books. One book is about the Ten Commandments and talking about what the Ten Commandments mean. Another is about faith. A third is about prayer. A fourth on the sacraments, which for Calvin, the only 2 practices that are connected to grace are baptism and the Eucharist or communion. And so another part of his book is saying the rest of the Catholic sacraments aren't truly about bringing grace. There's other things there about how churches should be organized and a chapter on civil government. Eventually it'll be divided into 4 books, and that's the way it will remain. The first book is God as Creator, second, Christ as Redeemer, third, the Spirit as imparter of sharing in Christ and good fruit, and fourth, the Church and its sacraments. Largely the book is intended for general audiences. If you would pick it up today, it's not really intended for a 21st century general audience, right? Because I mean, it's very dense at times. It's very particular. You could tell, right, that Calvin is a lawyer and how he approaches this. But at the time, it sells relatively well. The first edition sells out in the first year. It's a very powerful book, intended to say to the Holy Roman Emperor Francis, you don't need to treat Protestants, French Protestants, harshly. And so people are kind of open to a work like this, that's kind of systematizing a lot of the thinking about reform that's going on in various places. So he's gone to Switzerland, writes this, decides to settle in the city of Strasbourg. Strasbourg is today in modern-day France, but at the time, it's kind of this city that's out on its own. It's a free city of the Holy Roman Empire. It's not in France, it's not in Switzerland, but to do the head of religious life in Geneva is a man named William or Guillaume Farel. He's a French Lutheran and is kind of in charge of a variety of things there in Geneva. And he begs Calvin to stay. He knows of Calvin, he's read institutes, he thinks that Calvin would be a good religious influence in Geneva. Calvin declines. His plan is to go on to Strasbourg. And Farel begs him, stay. And eventually he threatens Calvin. He essentially curses him, right? If you don't stay, God is going to curse you. And so Calvin agrees to stay. I guess if you're cursed, right, stay. And essentially what he wants to do in Geneva is make it a city that is a prominent city of Reformation. And so he writes on worship, church organization, and kind of provides guidelines for Geneva. And he is promptly kicked out, right? And so he heads to Strasbourg. Thinking, I'll move to Strasbourg, I'll live a very quiet life. Serves as a pastor, serves as a teacher at a school in Strasbourg, continues writing. By this time in Calvin's life, right, we're talking the 1550s, there are discussions of reunification between Protestants and Catholics. So he's participating in some of those discussions. Are there ways that these two groups can reunify as Christians? During this time, he also gets married. But eventually, he will return to Geneva because the people of Geneva have a new government, and the people in the new government really like a lot of the things Calvin was saying. And so essentially, Calvin is given a lot of authority in Geneva to guide Geneva, to set up its laws, and to tell the Genevans how to live. He morally transforms the city. And the plan for he kind of draws up this plan where the church and government work together with the government enforcing religious decisions. It becomes a model city for other Protestants, especially in Switzerland. Right? They really like what Calvin is doing. In fact, a lot of Protestants who are fleeing Catholic persecution flee to Geneva. However, the government changes in Geneva, and Calvin's role becomes more unstable. And this instability is kind of recognized in the case of a man named Michael Servetus. Servetus was a physician, but had begun writing against the unity of church and state, had written on the Trinity, and had been under suspicion by the Inquisition. The Inquisition was an ecclesiastical court who was tasked with punishing heresy. Right? And so, the Inquisition's looking into Servetus. He escapes them, travels to Geneva. In Geneva, however, he will come into conflict with Calvin, and so even though he's fleeing Catholic power, he will, because of his writings on the Trinity, will also be in trouble there in Geneva, and Calvin will eventually order his execution. Eventually, he will create a university there in Geneva. It will become a very prominent one for the people of Geneva and as a kind of scholastic center of the Reformation. Any questions about Calvin? So we kind of have these three different strands going on. There's the Lutheran strand, the Zwinglian strand, and the Calvin strand. There'll be another strand we'll talk about, sometimes referred to as the Radical Reformation or the Anabaptists. We'll come and pick them up in a later class. Let's move now into talking about some of the things related to the politics and how that's affected. Since the 900s, the sizable government in the western part of Europe was the Holy Roman Empire. And some people have said, kind of sarcastically, it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, because it's largely Germany. Right? I mean, other groups are starting to break off. But this is the recognized power, right? This is the power that is shaped and molded by Catholicism and the papacy. Each of the regions of the Holy Roman Empire had individuals known as electors. When the emperor would die, those that were electors would meet together to choose the new emperor. Frederick the Wise, Frederick of Saxony, was one of these electors. Now, some of these electors, of course, become very prominent, and even though they espouse some ideas of Protestantism, or in the case of Frederick the Wise, support people like Luther, because they are the ones that are going to be choosing the new emperor, the Pope doesn't condemn them and doesn't go after them like people like Martin Luther or Zwingli, or even to a smaller extent, Calvin. Frederick of Saxony is, as I mentioned, also known as Frederick the Wise, very prominent elector. A lot of people think at the time that Frederick will be the new emperor. So when the current emperor, Francis, can't remember his name off the top of my head. When he dies, Frederick will likely become the new emperor. And so again, because even though he's siding with Luther, protecting Luther, the possibilities of him having political power are very good. However, though, Frederick will actually die, and Charles, who will become Charles V, will become the emperor of He's involved in a lot of conflict during his reign. Some of it's over territory, what territory is going to be controlled by the Holy Roman Empire. Some of it is over the power of the electors, and some of it's over Protestantism. Now, because of all these conflicts, Charles is focused on a variety of different things. And because some of it is political and not necessarily completely religious, his attention gets focused on that, and it allows Protestantism to spread and develop. And so, even though he's very Catholic, he's against Protestantism, because he has to be so focused on some of these political things, he ends up, Protestantism continues to flourish. Eventually, he will abdicate the throne. He will leave being emperor. So in one section, we have the power of the Holy Roman Empire. Elsewhere, we have other things going on, particularly in England. And particularly, very important for thinking about the Reformation is the reign of Henry VIII. Henry VIII's brother Arthur was actually heir to the throne. Arthur was older than Henry. Henry's father, Henry VII, for whatever reason, chose to name his first son Arthur and then his second son Henry. So Arthur is heir to the throne. and married to Catherine of Aragon, who is the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, and she is the aunt of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. So essentially what Henry VII does is create this political alliance, connect England and Spain together. But Arthur dies without an heir and before becoming king. And so the decision is made that Henry would marry Catherine in order to maintain this alliance with Spain. But this type of marriage required that the Pope give his approval or give a dispensation for it to take place, because it was technically considered in English eyes and in the eyes of Catholicism as incest. And so even though he's marrying his brother's widow, it's still considered incest. Which is, if you've studied Hamlet, right, that's the whole big problem in Hamlet is Claudius is married to Hamlet's widow. So the Pope is appealed to allow this union. And the Pope really needs Spain to help support his authority, and so he allows it. During this time, again, prior to Henry being king, he attacks Martin Luther's position. And because of that, he's named Defender of the Faith. Very prestigious title. And so here is Henry defending Catholicism against the Protestantism, particularly of Martin Luther. However, especially as Henry becomes king, there are some problems that begin to occur. Henry and Catherine are failing to have a male heir. Several children are stillborn. Several others die shortly after birth. Eventually, one of the children, a daughter named Mary, survives. Now, Henry also has an illegitimate son, but that doesn't figure into the succession. Henry decides he needs a divorce. And he wants to get this marriage taken care of because there's no male heir, but also because he's fallen in love with Anne Boleyn. And so he and his advisors appeal to the Pope, and they want Catherine and Henry's marriage annulled. The reason they say the annulment should go through is because the marriage is incestuous. So they had to get it. They had to get a dispensation to say it's okay to marry, but now they're saying, right, all these children born dead or dying shortly after, that proves that God is against this union. And the Pope says no, because Catherine of Aragon is still the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, and she is still the aunt of Charles V. If he would allow that annulment, Spain would be furious. The Holy Roman Emperor would be furious, right? So the Pope says, no, it's not happening. And so Henry and his advisors decide to encourage the passage of the Act of Supremacy. Essentially, the Act of Supremacy declared England to be an empire and prohibited English citizens from appealing to foreign powers. Right? So you can't appeal to foreign powers, people in other countries. Oh, who else is a foreign power? The Pope. Right? Because the Pope has political power. So, Henry has now cut off the church in England from the Catholic Church through a legislative act. Ultimately, he becomes officially the head of the church. Additionally, Mary, his daughter, through Catherine of Aragon, is declared illegitimate by an act of Parliament. So Parliament says Mary is an illegitimate child. Henry divorces and marries Anne Boleyn. They too have problems having children. And only one of their children survives, a girl named Elizabeth. Henry will later have Anne executed for treason. And so divorces the first wife, second wife is executed. He will then marry Jane Seymour. Jane has a son named Edward. but then Jane dies while giving birth to Edward. So once again, Henry is without a wife. Henry will marry 3 more times. He will divorce Anne of Cleves, he will behead Catherine Howard, and then Catherine Parr is the one who survives Henry's death. Right? So she's still married to him when Henry dies, probably fortunately for her. So at his death, there are 3 illegitimate heirs, because the son is kind of out of it. There are 2 illegitimate heirs, Elizabeth and Mary, and then there is a son named Edward. Edward, as the legitimate male heir, will ascend to the throne and become Edward VI. Technically, he's Protestant, but he's not. So it's more like his advisors are Protestants. He will eventually die at the age of 16 from tuberculosis. During his reign, he approved, again through his advisors, destruction of stained glass windows, destructions of images, other types of things that we could talk about as persecution of Catholics. But he also allowed clergy to marry. So in the Church of England, or the Anglican Church, priests can get married. Also, during Edward's reign, is the publishing of a very important document for the Church of England, the Book of Common Prayer, which is an English language style of worship, or pattern of worship. Right? So prayers in English, songs in English, other types of things, as opposed to the Latin version within Catholicism. As I mentioned, Edward reigns for 7 years, dies at the age of 16. Parliament decides, well, Mary's now legitimate again. Right? So she had been an illegitimate child until Edward dies, and so she is now, again, a legitimate heir to the throne. So Mary ascends to the throne. She is the first English queen to rule in her own right. Every other queen had been, married to the king. But Mary is very Catholic. Remember, her mother is Catherine of Aragon. Right? So we're talking Spanish Catholicism here. So it's very Catholic. And so Mary restores papal authority, restores Catholic practice, and the clergy are now ordered to give up their wives. Right? So Edward said you could get married, they get married, now you got to give up your wives. She now, in turn, persecutes Protestants. In fact, during her rule, 300 Protestants were burned as heretics, earning her the nickname Bloody Mary. Some of these Protestants who are persecuted flee to the city of Geneva, where Calvin is. Now remember, I said a lot of refugees go. And so they see Calvin's approach firsthand. Eventually they will come back after Mary's death and will form the core of what become known as the Puritans, which we'll talk about actually when we talk about the 17th century. Mary dies in 1558 with no heir. And so Parliament turns to now the third child of Henry VIII, Elizabeth. Elizabeth, too, had been declared illegitimate. Her legitimacy was reinstated again. She is the daughter of Anne Boleyn, and despite the taint of her mother's treason, she had been rather well educated. And she, too, returns to the reforms, but she wants to have control of the church, because she's seeing some things, not only in Europe, but also in England, where religious dissidents, right, religious people going back and forth, religious people challenging those in authority, leads to political dissidence. Plus, she wants uniformity. She wants everybody to just be united and agree to the same thing. And so she tries to find a way to accommodate Catholics and Protestants together instead of trying to side with one or the other. And so that Anglican Church, the Church of England, is one that seeks moderation. But Catholics can't accept what she's saying, and these very strict Protestants don't like the fact that Anglicanism is looking kind of Catholic, right? So the Catholics don't like it because it's Protestant. Some very strict Protestants don't like it because it's Catholic. And so, there's this kind of tension still, although Anglicanism tries to put this moderate standpoint, keep some things of Catholicism, but also other things of Protestantism. Her cousin, Mary Stuart, who is the Queen of Scotland, tries to take the throne of England, and she's very Catholic, right? So she thinks, all right, she's encouraged to take the throne of England, bring back Catholicism to the British Isles. Elizabeth has her arrested and executed. But Elizabeth, too, dies without a child. And so James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary Stuart, will ascend to the throne, right? It's way back there, he's a great-grandchild of Henry VII, right? There was a marriage between one of the children of Henry VII and the King of Scotland, and so that's how he ends up in charge of the throne. So he is in charge of the throne of Scotland. He will eventually become King of England. There he will take the name James I. We'll pick up with James when we get to the 17th century. We'll go ahead and pause there. We'll pick up with some more political things on next Wednesday. Right? No class on Monday because of Martin Luther King holiday. So we'll pick up next Wednesday with some more politics, culture, and society, and those kind of things. Don't forget, reading quiz. There's no reading quiz on Monday. There is a reading quiz due next Wednesday. If you forgot to take the reading quiz today, I will leave it open. I'll let you go back, right? Give you an extra time to go back and take it, right? If you forgot to take it, right? Even though we dropped to, don't want to get started on the wrong foot. So if you didn't have a chance, go ahead and take that. But remember, next Wednesday by 9:40 is the second reading quiz. Have a good week.